Hello, I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society. Budget cutbacks are taking effect. Taxes are going up. The transit fare was increased, and unemployment continues to rise. New Yorkers at risk. Next on the Urban Agenda. Joining me now are three advocates on behalf of New Yorkers in Need. Meryl Kordower, Assistant Vice President with FEGS, Health and Human Service System. Patrick Markee, Senior Policy Analyst at the Coalition for the Homeless. And Margaret Purvis, Vice President of Programs and Services at the Food Bank for New York City. Welcome to the Urban Agenda.
Thank you for having us.
Well, let's start with you, Meryl, since you're talking about the issue of employment. And what is going on is we've been told that actually it's just white-collar people who are losing their jobs, and as soon as they get fixed, everything's going to be fine. What are you seeing at FEGS?
Well, I can tell you that being in the business for a long time, more than 10 years, this is probably the worst time in employment that we've seen since the 1990s, and it may get even worse than that. At this point, coming through our offices, we are seeing a whole host of folks coming in. We're seeing people who have been unemployed for 6 months, 1 year, or even more than a year. We're working with probably 10,000 people a year at all levels, people applying for public assistance who never applied before in their lives.
What have they been doing? I mean,
well, they've been in job search. Many have been on unemployment. Unemployment numbers today really reflect those that are collecting unemployment and not those who have stopped looking for jobs or who have exhausted their unemployment. So the real issues are that the numbers are probably larger than we anticipate that we see outside. The competition out there is great. There are jobs in some areas, and there are some sectors, the healthcare industry, teaching, and the not-for-profit world seems to be kind of on the rise in bringing in new jobs. But it's against everything else that's taking place in the city where those jobs are just falling. And every day you hear something new, whether it's on cranes or in the newspaper, that more and more people are being laid off. And obviously what's happening in the city is affecting that as well.
Now, what is the unemployment rate that we're looking at now?
Well, it depends on who you talk to, and it depends on what day you catch it. You know, unemployment in New York is over 8%. In New York, in certain boroughs in the Bronx, it's much higher. Right. And when they talk about New York State in general, in some parts of New York State, which is in upper New York, it's much lower. But we're seeing a very significant number in the city that are unemployed.
So we have unemployment. What is this doing, for instance, to the issue of people coming for food? And Margaret, your organization is dealing with this.
Absolutely. Well, one thing we can say is that the face of hunger has completely changed. That idea of the homeless man in baggy clothes coming to the soup kitchen is no longer the look.
Of my generation.
Absolutely.
That's the view.
Absolutely. Right now we're looking at about 1.5 million New Yorkers relying on food assistance from soup kitchens, food pantries, shelters, senior centers. We feed about 500,000 people a week. We are seeing families, half of that number are children and the elderly. So this is, the face of hunger has completely changed.
And are these people who had been relying on support for food before, or is this
Well,
new?
we definitely saw a major spike right after 9/11. However, it's gone up even higher since then. I mean, the numbers now are even, I would say, I think we've seen maybe even a 20% increase since 9/11.
And what are the distribution mechanisms? How do you provide food for that many people?
Well, the Food Bank for New York City we have a warehouse. We are the provider of food to about 1,100 food programs throughout New York City.
Right.
So we're in every borough. We have trucks have about 14 trucks on the streets every single day. We're constantly receiving food in, and then we're ensuring that that food is distributed to the programs who are in those communities.
And how's your funding going? Are you getting great support at this point for what's going on?
The funding has been, I think right now we mostly say it's about flat. I mean, we're seeing a decrease obviously in corporate giving by about 25%. However,
aren't they worried about the people they're laying off? Maybe, the corporate executive
I'm sure
may need food at some point.
I'm sure they're worried. However,
Right.
we are seeing some increases in corporations giving us gifts in kind and services.
So
However,
there's
as
an
far as the
understanding.
financial donations. They are in fact down, corporations.
Now, I want to come back to you to talk about the food stamp issue because
Okay.
there's been a lot of concern. Homelessness. We always, the picture of poverty has always been connected with the fact of the homeless. What's the condition now? Is homelessness on the rise? Who are the homeless from your vantage point?
Well, absolutely, homelessness is on the rise. In fact, it's at all-time record levels in New York City and continuing to rise. And I think in the same way that the image that people have of hunger in New York City has changed in recent years, so has the image of homelessness. It always was the case that the majority of homeless people in New York City were families with children. However, we're seeing an even greater proportion of homeless people represented among children and their families. 80% of New Yorkers who sleep in shelters each night are children and their parents.
And give the audience some numbers. What are we dealing
The numbers
with?
are really staggering. Currently, 38,500 New Yorkers sleep in New York City shelters each night. When Mayor Bloomberg came into office, there were 30,000 people a night in shelters. 5 years ago, there were 21,000 people a night in shelters. In fact, the number of homeless children, which represents 17,000 out of those 38,500, has doubled in the last 5 years. It's simply staggering. And just to give you an idea, the other night I was up at the city's emergency assistance unit in the Bronx, which is the central intake office for homeless families. The place was literally packed, just overwhelmed. Literally, you saw children and their parents sleeping in the corridors, laying down on the floors in crowded hallways. And I think that's something that we're going to see for a few more months.
Now, has the mayor visited this stuff? Has he come and looked?
It's frustrating. I mean, I think city officials tend to portray the problems at the emergency assistance unit and in the shelter system in a much more, let's say, gentle way than actually what we're seeing out in the system. The city last week actually, this was I think a couple weeks ago, actually predicted that the numbers of homeless families will rise from the current number now, just over 9,000, to 10,000 by this summer. So there's clearly no end in sight to the rise in homelessness.
And what about and we'll start talking in all these areas, what are the cutbacks going to do to this whole process? This is on relatively stable budgets.
Right.
Now we're talking even with the infusions, even if the State Assembly and the State Senate manage to pass their bills and override the potential governor's veto, there are cutbacks, I assume.
It's interesting. With the problem with homelessness, I think we're seeing is the mayor's budget actually repeats the mistakes that the previous mayor, Giuliani, made in a way that cuts back on permanent solutions to the problem of homelessness and cuts back on prevention programs in a way that leads us to spend more money on shelter. Last year, the city spent $100 million more on emergency shelter for the homeless than it did the previous year, but that was because of cutbacks in housing programs, cutbacks in prevention programs, and unfortunately, Mayor Bloomberg's budget again makes that mistake. It cuts on legal services for low-income tenants who are involved in housing court, information tables in housing court. It cuts back on other prevention programs, and most significantly, it makes a reduction in the capital budget for affordable housing, meaning that we'll see less housing built for low-income New Yorkers, and that, of course, is at the root of this problem.
Meryl, explain how FEGS works. I don't know if all the audience knows what FEGS is. I know FEGS, but why don't you explain how you work and what the interaction is?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about our agency. We're a very large not-for-profit in New York City. We employ about 3,000 people a year, and we service between 50 and 60,000 people, 50 and 60,000 New Yorkers and Long Island folks every day, on a yearly basis, I'm sorry. And our goal really is to provide the kind of human services people need. So I'm responsible for many of our employment programs. We run mental health clinics, we run youth programs, we're in schools, we run beacon programs, we run residential programs for the mentally ill.
So what's the budget going to do to you?
Well, it's interesting. We're funded in a variety of ways. We get funds from the federal government, from private dollars from city and state, and as a part of our agency, we compete for existing dollars that exist. There are dollars available to service the numbers of people that are out there, but as the numbers increase, it just gets harder and harder. And the numbers in my division, which is probably close to 10,000, are people that we're servicing, and those are 10,000 new people every year who are seeking employment assistance.
Now talk to me about the people you're serving. Are these people without high school degrees, or are they out skills? Are they immigrant? Are they largely, indigenous people?
Well,
where are they coming from?
They are across the board. They are individuals at levels who we normally would have seen before. People on public assistance with limited education, limited language skills. We are seeing middle-income folks who clearly have been out of work for a couple of years now, and now kind of needing the other kinds of services that are being discussed today because they are at risk of losing their home. They have not been working for many years. Their children may have been in private school and now are going to public school. And then we're seeing folks who, recent college grads, who are not getting the jobs because there are no jobs out there or the competition is so great. And I do want to focus in on that. There are jobs out there. Right. The salaries have come down because of what has taken place. Right. And the competition is so great amongst folks that people who with a master's degree or a bachelor's degree are now competing again for some of those lower level jobs because they need to get back into the workforce.
How in the world is someone coming off welfare who hasn't gotten a high school degree going to compete with this kind of situation?
Well, it's difficult, but it's not impossible, and we are seeing it in our Bronx programs. We still place 25 to 50 people a week in a variety of different jobs. Right. They tend to be very low level, minimum wage jobs with not many benefits.
So they don't have health care.
They don't have health care, but while they're on public assistance, we work with them to try to get them better jobs. So there are benefits that do come with them while they're on public assistance. Obviously, child care is a big issue in the city and continues to be an issue for folks who are on public assistance. And I do want to mention also, it has hit every group in the city. And we're now seeing, interestingly, folks who have retired or who took buyout packages who can't make it, or people who are 70 years of age who thought that they could live on Social Security and finding that they can't and are coming back for part-time jobs.
Just to echo that, we were doing a lot of 9/11 work helping low-wage workers, and one of the most mind-boggling was I think a 75-year-old messenger who had never taken anything, whose entire paychecks for like a month were wiped out, and all his job security, and they were going to throw him out of his SRO. Incredible hard-working person. We'll be right back to continue with the Urban Agenda.
Are your kids getting enough art? Whether through poetry, dance, music, or drama, the arts open the doors to creativity. As a mother and teacher, I know that arts education can help our children develop confidence and a better understanding of the world around them. Even if you have just 30 minutes a week, get your kids more involved in the arts and think about the kind of world we can leave behind for our children and our children's children.
Art. Ask for more. AmericansForTheArts.org.
We're talking with Meryl Kordower, Assistant Vice President with FEGS Health and Human Service System, Patrick Markee, Senior Policy Analyst at the Coalition for the Homeless, and Margaret Purvis, Vice President of Programs and Services at the Food Bank for New York City. Let me start with you, Margaret. Okay, we were hearing how this is a changed population in terms of who's coming for services.
Yes.
Is that true with food as well?
Absolutely. We sometimes even get phone calls. You should know that the average soup kitchen, food pantry, it's typically located in a faith-based organization. Okay. It's typically run by either some lovely church lady who stepped out to make sure that the service is there for her community. Well, we now get phone calls from them because they're actually being asked to stretch operations in ways that they never thought they would ever have to do. And what I mean by that is they're thinking, okay, I get to put the food in the bag, hand the family the bag.
Right.
Now they're having families coming to them. Well, first of all, they'll call me and say, Margaret, this guy has on a suit. Or they're asking me about information about a job. I don't know anything about this. I mean, this person got into this to feed, and they thought that they would only have to feed.
That.
But now they're being pulled in so many different areas because the families, the individuals are coming to them with so many different needs that they're not truly accustomed to.
Is there a frustration here that, maybe New Yorkers, or sometimes I look at discussions on television and I hear the talk show people hammering away at various sort of, the poor shouldn't be considered. Do people get this? What's as you talk to people at the food, the soup kitchens and the rest, do people understand what's going on in New York City?
I think that a lot of the soup kitchen managers have been slow to understand. I think that for some of them, it almost felt like it kind of came out of nowhere, if you will, because they have their core clients that they've been working with for years, families that they know in the community, and you see one segment of the community. Now they're basically seeing all the layers of their community, and it is something that's a little jarring, especially when maybe their visitors to their pantry look a whole lot more like them, a whole lot more like their children, their grandchildren, and it's jarring, as you would imagine.
Now, with the homeless population, are we seeing the same kind of changing demographic?
We're seeing, I mean, I think the principal difference is we're seeing more working people who are staying in shelters, working families, working single adults, staying in shelters and unable to get out of the shelter system because of the dearth of affordable housing out in the city.
Well, to that, we did this survey last year, and it's already before the real crunch hit, of 600 New Yorkers. It was done by a national survey firm. And the numbers we started to get back of more than 50% of the people who were either unable to get adequate food or couldn't get housing or who were out of work, it was mind-boggling. And already we were tilted. First of all, these people had phones. And secondly, I don't know about you, but most people don't admit what's going wrong, or at least try to temper it because they don't want to, you have to give yourself your own story. The fact that so many people were willing to admit such really, family-threatening indications make this something we really haven't seen since the 1930s, really. We're starting to enter an area that we just don't know about.
Yeah, I mean, we're starting to see folks who never thought they would be in this situation, either coming into our eviction prevention program or ending up in our office because they've ended up in the shelter system. I mean, folks who've worked their whole lives and suddenly got laid off. And I think it's important to remember that for a lot of low-income New Yorkers and moderate-income New Yorkers, the old saying that you're just 2 paychecks away from homelessness really holds true. And when you lose those 2 paychecks and the landlord takes you to housing court, there's not many options you've got.
Now, the city started, at least before this whole budget crisis, to talk about Mayor Bloomberg's new housing, moderate and low-income housing plan. Is there any signs that this is going to have any impact on what you're seeing?
I think I'd have to say it won't, and particularly in the short term. I mean, I think the mayor's plan is a step forward in the sense that it's some new money, and it represents a real plan after the previous administration basically took us for 8 years without a real housing plan. But compare the Bloomberg plan with the Koch administration's 10-year plan from the 80s. That plan produced 10% of all the housing units, or set aside 10% of all the housing units for homeless families and individuals, and the majority of the housing created was for low-income households. In comparison, the Bloomberg plan is tilted much more towards middle-income and moderate-income households. Those are groups that also have housing needs, but the folks with the most desperate housing needs, the homeless, the low-income people earning under $25,000 a year are really not going to benefit as much.
Now, Meryl, in terms of the clients you're seeing, how are they, what is their housing and food and other situation? Obviously, you can't just deal with the employment issue.
Well, employment starts the issue, and then everything kind of exacerbates after that. Being that people are unemployed for a long period of time, there are mental health issues. We're clearly seeing housing issues. We have individuals who call us and say they can't afford to come for services because they can't afford transportation. And it's clear that when we talk with folks who've been out of work for a long period of time, they've changed. They look different. They sound different. The way they carry themselves. They've been beaten down by the system, and it is hard to try to motivate them because the competition is so great that they have to be on all the time. And unless you're doing a full-time job search today, it really is a full-time commitment that one needs to make to upgrade their skills, to be competitive, and to understand how the system works, because you're competing against everyone that's out there.
Let's talk about a discrete group in this event, and that's the elderly. How are they coping with this? Are we seeing elderly as homeless? Are we seeing elderly showing up at the soup kitchens?
We are absolutely seeing the elderly showing up at soup kitchens, food pantries, and shelters. I mean, a lot of these people are really relying on multiple programs to ensure that they have enough food just to get by.
I mean, I think another thing that we need to keep in mind, there's been a lot of attention paid recently to tax increases. Certainly the subway fare increase is going to affect everybody. But the proposed rent increases that were recently voted on.
Let's talk about that. How will that play out for your population?
Unbelievable. We're looking at 1 million apartments in New York City. 2.5 million tenants who live in those apartments could be affected by the largest rent increases that we've seen in 14 years. 5.5% increases on one-year leases. These are the kinds of things that for the senior citizen who's on
just
a
on the
fixed
margin.
income, who doesn't have other sorts of subsidy or can't access the few subsidies that are out there, that's the kind of thing that could drive them into homelessness. And you know, you can't scrimp on your rent. You know, people can cut back on their clothing budget. For food, they can go to an emergency food program if there's food there, but you can't, you know, tell your landlord, I can't pay all my rent this month. You know, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, and obviously smaller landlords. I mean, we always think of landlords as, you know, the predatory landlord, but now with, you know, there was already a water and sewer hit. There were other, you know, rent increases. There are other costs that are going. So we've squeezed a sector, and we're squeezing out basically the low side of the rental market.
Yeah.
Okay, how are we going to fix it? I mean, each of us have a take on this from the employment side. What would you see done here? Okay, you're Mayor Bloomberg, or maybe you don't. With his poll numbers, no, somebody else.
Well, maybe not today.
Okay.
I think clearly the economy has to change, because what we have to do is we have to see there's got to be, everything affects employment in New York City. Tourism will affect it, and obviously we want people to come into New York because that affects a lot of the services that are here. We have a lot of students in school. We have to find summer youth programs for them.
Well, they've just cut that back.
Well, and we're aware of that.
Yeah.
We have to be able to provide services for people who are at risk of kind of going to the next step beyond just looking for employment, and that's something that we're really focusing on and trying to help people. And it's going to be very tight for the next couple of months. Economists have figured that the economy was going to change and get better by the summer. I don't anticipate that that's going to happen in the very near future, but we're looking at trying to be optimistic and trying to keep people motivated, because at all levels we have schools that are going to be cutting, ending in June. We have, a whole host of different people that are still looking for employment at all levels. Our unemployment is at the highest level it's been. We have people on public assistance, and those rates keep going up after dropping for many years. I don't know what all the answers are going to be, but I think that clearly there's got to be a focus on bringing some and getting this economy started.
One of the things I'm upset with the administration, both state, city, and federal, is even if you don't have the resources, there should be at least a sense of compassion for the suffering people are going through, and I don't hear it. I hear a lot of other things, but I just don't hear it. Okay, what would you do about it? How would we fix it?
Well, there are lots of fixes. I think
Right.
if we looked at government, on the government side, we certainly want to ensure that they don't eliminate the city resource of the Emergency Food Assistance Program. We want to make sure that access to food stamps goes up. For individuals, there are many opportunities to give.
And that's sort of weird, because the city has been preventing people from getting food. I don't get that, but maybe you know why. They're eating too much, obviously. Absolutely impossible. This is another weight reduction effort for the poor.
Yeah, to work against obesity.
Yeah.
But it's very important that people obviously act locally.
Right.
On our website, www.foodbanknyc.org, you can find local places to find food. You can also use that same list to find places in your community to give food if you are not in this particular situation.
Would you give the FEGS website
absolutely.
number too?
Sure.
And then I want to
It's
close.
www.fegs.org, and from our website you can gain all of the services available in New York City and Long Island for all the services that we have to offer.
Patrick, what would you do about this? I mean, you're suddenly mayor. You might say who, or maybe you will be, but what would you do about it?
I mean, I think this is a classic case of an ounce of prevention is a pound of cure, saves a pound of cure. The funny thing with sort of homelessness is that we're spending a lot more money on emergency shelter. We're spending a lot more money on the sort of emergency room model of addressing this problem, instead of making the investments at the front end that will save us money down the road. So even in an era of tight budgets, what the city ought to be doing is making those investments in affordable housing on the capital side that will save the money on shelter and other emergency care down the road. It's not only the right thing in terms of reducing homelessness and helping people with their housing problems, it's the right thing in terms of saving money. And then in terms of the rent increases that have been proposed, they must be rolled back. I mean, nothing bigger is going to.
I know we've been working with a group of legislators. If we can't get a total rollback, at least there should be some circuit breaker for the poor.
Yeah, absolutely.
That would allow us to, if you're very elderly Or if your income is so low, what's the point of allowing that rent increase to drive you into homelessness, which will cost the city, as you're saying, 10 times as much?
Exactly.
My thanks to Meryl Kordower with FEGS, Patrick Markee of the Coalition for the Homeless, and Margaret Purvis from the Food Bank for New York City. These are tough times for poor and working poor New Yorkers, and with no end in sight. Homelessness, unemployment, and hunger are sharply on the rise with today's economy. Too many New Yorkers find themselves in deep trouble. We must remain vigilant in caring for those unable to cope with the economic crisis that is gripping our city. I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society. Thank you for watching The Urban Agenda.
To comment on the Urban Agenda or for more information on CSS, contact Community Service Society of New York, 105 East 22nd Street, New York, New York, 10010. Area code 212-254-8900.